Kristen Nevadal serves as a board chair for the International Cannabis Farmers Association, and Kristen Nevadal serves as a board member for the California Cannabis Industry Association, and Kristen Nevadal serves as a cannabis industry representative to California's Cannabis Advisory Committee. Kristen co-founded and served on the board of the Emerald Growers Association and has been an outdoor cannabis farmer for over 20 years. So you might say that Kristen Nevadal is in an excellent position to compare the environmental impacts, efficiency, and desirability of seasonal sun-grown cannabis provided by a family farm to a year-round indoor high-intensity growing operation.
A little overview of what we're going to talk about today. This is largely a policy conversation. We're going to thread some sustainability and look at the environmental impacts associated with policy, not just in California, but we're going to look at how cannabis cultivation might impact our environment on a national level. And I think we can take that information and kind of predict or have some insights as to what cannabis, the industry as a whole, cultivation especially, what kind of risks it poses to the environment on a global level. And then we'll talk about solutions as part of today's program. So some national public policy stats in relationship to cannabis. We currently have 30 states in the US that have some form of medical cannabis legalization happening. That does not mean that all 30 of these states actually have a seed-to-sale program. Some of them have immaculate conception programs, right, where you actually can have the cannabis, you can consume the cannabis, but there's no way to cultivate it, purchase it, process it, or manufacture it. So some of these states have what we kind of refer to as CBD programs, where you or the parent or the patient has to basically import at their own risk. Right, so we still have some of that going on. Additionally, 9 states plus the District of Columbia have fully legalized cannabis for adult use, and all of the adult use programs have full seed-to-sale models that have been implemented. Out of these programs, I meant to put a number in for X, my apology, but the list is very short. So out of, say, 24, 25 programs, seed-to-sale programs for medical, we only have 6 states that legally allow the cannabis to be cultivated outdoors or farmed, as I like to say. Washington has some outdoor cannabis cultivation. There was definitely more when the program came on board. 502, the legalization of cannabis, is what actually brought regulated cannabis to Washington. They had a decriminalized cannabis or an affirmative defense program for medical for a number of years. Oregon and California have the 2 largest outdoor programs of anywhere in the United States. Arizona has just started issuing outdoor cultivation licenses for cannabis, but they have a very old medical cannabis program, one of the older programs in the country. And Maryland, I put an asterisk next to Maryland because Maryland legally allows outdoor cultivation. It's not prohibited in their statute, but they have not permitted any outdoor cultivation facilities to date. And I did skip over Colorado. Colorado was our first commercial cannabis program in the United States, and it started 100% indoor, and in the last few years has just started to welcome some outdoor cannabis cultivation, mostly in the Pueblo, Colorado area. It's about the only region in Colorado that's allowing it. And I think they're friendlier to hemp, of course, and when we think about these different laws, I'm referring to specifically what I would call, say, drug-type cannabis, THC-rich cannabis, not hemp, because hemp in every program in the US and throughout the world is cultivated outdoors. So the drug-type cannabis or the THC-rich cannabis, about 90% of our national and global public policies allowing for this crop to be utilized for medicine forces that production indoors and to a lesser extent into all-season greenhouse facilities. Here in California, as I mentioned, we have multiple types of opportunity for cannabis cultivators. So I included some references or definitions here from California. Outdoor cannabis cultivation is cannabis that's cultivated outdoors using natural light. You can use some artificial light under an outdoor cultivation license for the purpose of propagation, but not to assist flowering. And I don't know if everybody's familiar with what light deprivation techniques do for farming, right? Where you force a short day to force an early flower of a plant. This is really popular in cannabis cultivation. As soon as you pull a tarp in California to close your greenhouse or your open air hoop, you are forced out of the outdoor tier and into the mixed light tier. But let me back up for just a moment because I want to say a couple things about this picture here. This picture here is a half acre approximately of outdoor cannabis. I think it's really worth mentioning because as you can see in the forefront of the picture, the cannabis is planted directly in the ground. This is in the Holmes Flat area of Humboldt County. It's an alluvial floodplain, and this cannabis is 100% dry farmed. It uses 0 water, and it is not fed. So the soil here is very rich. It's on the curve of a river, right, of the Eel River. And in the giant flood of '64, upstream from this site here, this is a big farming area in Humboldt County, upstream from it was all of kind of the large mills. And when the flood came, it kind of washed out the log decks, but it washed out all of the sawdust as well and deposited layers and layers of sawdust and river sediment onto this plain. And so what we have here is a lot of dry farming. Cannabis is being dry farmed by the acre here, and it is very high quality, and it's just absolutely amazing for me to see. I love it. So I wanted to bring some pictures. This is that same farm. No? Where this is, it's not irrigated, and it doesn't rain. However, it is in the Eel River Valley. It's kind of midway into the county, so it does get some late summer fogs in the morning, and so we don't have necessarily the really hot temperatures that people might be accustomed to in southern Humboldt. It's a little bit of a milder climate, shorter season, but it does not rain during the summer there. There's some ambient moisture, and that's about it. It's pretty amazing because you can stand on that farm and then look at the neighbor's place, and about 20 or 30 feet up the hillside, the grass changes from green to brown at the end of the summer. So the water table is really high there. And so we named this farm, my friend who runs this farm, the name of the farm is High Water Farms, High Water Dry Farm, because the water table is so high. This here is a picture, I would consider this outdoor, but according to the state, this is a light deprivation activity is happening here. So this turns into a mixed light tier 1 facility now. Even though this cannabis is dry farmed, it is open to all of the elements. It's in the ground, right? But it's technically a mixed light product because mixed light cultivation happens in hoop houses, greenhouses, glass houses, conservatories, hothouses, or other similar structures, right? With a combination of natural light and light deprivation and one of the following lighting models. So High Water Farms falls into the mixed light tier 1 here because they use 0 watts of light. So anything under 6 watts of light and pulling a tarp, your light depth, right? If you use more than 6 watts of light and less than 25 watts, you move into tier 2. And by and far, most mixed light cultivation looks similar to this. This is a fully automated greenhouse. This would definitely be a mixed light tier 2 facility because of the amount of lighting utilized in this facility. So if you notice, there's high intensity discharge lighting along the ceiling. Shade cloths are drawn right now, but there's fully automated blackout tarps happening in this greenhouse. And this would be year-round production versus this, which they're getting 2 harvests per year on the natural light cycles here. California also, like many other states, allows for indoor cannabis cultivation. And indoor cannabis cultivation is in any kind of structure, right? There's not really a rule around it having to be fully enclosed. It could even be in a greenhouse. But once you use more than 25 watts a square foot, you are kicked into this indoor tier. So it's not really about in the absence of sunlight or 100% artificial light. It's about being over the 25 watt per square foot threshold in the state of California. Kind of a unique way to look at it, I think. It really actually removes kind kind of an agricultural model. I really thought we were going to go into developing public policy and regulations around cannabis cultivation from the perspective of agriculture and treat it like agriculture. And I was really thrilled when we were assigned CDFA as the chief regulator for cannabis cultivation. I've worked on lots of farms. I've filed a lot of farm paperwork. I've filed CCOF paperwork for produce farms. And this is nothing like a traditional agricultural model, right? When we look at traditional agriculture, you go into the Department of Food and Agriculture, you declare when you're planting your crop, you declare how much you're planting, the exact variety you're planting, how much you anticipate yielding, how much you anticipate that going to the market for, and when, right? And if you're going to replant that, you just fill out another line. So I planted beets in May, I'm gonna plant beets again in September or August, right, for a late crop. So in cannabis, we created these tiered models. And this might not be sequentially in order, but let me just have a little conversation with you about one of the things that California thought they got right that I don't think they really got right. They decided that they would do a scaled licensing system in California. And the idea was to provide multiple points of entry for farmers and businesses of all sizes to participate in the newly regulated marketplace. So they said, okay, we're gonna have outdoor cultivation, mixed light cultivation of 2 types, and then indoor cultivation. And then within all of that, there's different sizes, right? There's a specialty cottage that allows around 2,500 square feet of cultivation if you're outdoor or a mixed light person, right, licensee, or 500 square feet of cultivation if you're indoor. It's all very complex. And then we move up to a specialty license, which allows for cultivation of 2,501 square feet up to 5,000 in any of those tiers. And then we move to a small license, which is 5,001 to 10,000. And then we move to a medium license, which is the largest size license we have in California. License holders are limited to one of those medium licenses. And for outdoor producers, that license allows you to cultivate between 10,001 and 44,000, roughly an acre, square feet of cultivation. And in the mixed light tiers or license types and the indoor license type, it allows you to cultivate 10,001 square feet to 22,000 square feet. The idea was, like I said, to have different tiers that people could come into the marketplace, and it was supposed to kind of broaden and help ease the barriers and the scales of economy. So in trying to figure out how to price this, because they aren't looking at how much is produced in any of those models, they aren't looking at how much is grossed by the farmer in any of the models, which is a traditional agricultural model. You're like, well, I made between this and this last year, so my cost to file my producer handler certificate this year, it falls into this licensing range, right? That's not what we did for cannabis. We said, oh, we're just gonna put this little square on the ground, and if you are in that square of 5,000 square feet, you're gonna pay this, right? So in the ML1 tier, if I harvest that once or I harvest that 4 times, I pay the same amount for that license. And when doing this, the state said, okay, we're gonna look at the cost of licensing based on kind of what is it gonna cost people per square foot and how much are they gonna produce, and they kind of thought they could create these buckets, right, based on square footage. They didn't quite get it right, but what it breaks down to is if we look at all of these activities in a small cultivation setting, right? The medium outdoor is up here for contrast, really. But if I break down just my licensing cost and my yield, knowing that seasonal cannabis produces around 20 grams per square foot and of finished flower, trimmed, ready for package, and high-intensity discharge light cannabis is usually around 10 grams more, right, around 30, and it just kind of depends on your ability and the cultivar you're working with and whatnot. But when we look at that 20, 30 gram per square foot range, what we see is that this small ML1 tier, like we just looked at, right, outdoors, pulling a tarp, if I only get one harvest out of that, I am paying almost $30 a pound in state licensing fee, right? This is a 5 harvest indoor, and at 5 harvests, that is $11.91 a pound. Most ML1 licenses and outdoor license holders are going to spend more per pound in state licensing fee than their more industrial all year cultivation license types of the same square footage. So the numbers don't necessarily provide equitable scaling, and we've really had a lot of conversation with CDFA and feel really challenged with this, but it's one of the things the state, I think, needs to really clean up. And I think we'll see that when we get to some slides I have towards the end of the presentation, that this right here is part of how we got to where we are today. And where we are today, I don't think is really where we want to be as a state developing this program. I don't think it meets the climate goals, the environmental goals, or kind of the ethos that California has for developing industry. So a couple other things that the state did do which were unique and that we saw as opportunities for farmers, especially legacy farmers, family farmers that have been on their land for a long time, was that they created two pieces of statute in both the MRSA, which was the legislative piece that passed medical marijuana regulations in 2015, and then that was repeated in the voter initiative, Proposition 64, which passed in 2016. They created an indication of source opportunity, which really is a county of origin, right? And it says if you cultivate cannabis in Humboldt County, and then you can put a Humboldt County label on it. If I cultivate cannabis in Humboldt County, it's illegal for me to put a Kern County label on it, right? That product has to be produced in the county that I am labeling it from. Very similar to the AVA system in California, right? The AVA system is really largely about political boundaries. It's not about standards, practices, varietals, which is what appellation of origin is more about. Appellation of origin is the branding opportunity. It's a very old branding opportunity that was developed largely to protect small producers of specialty products of high quality that were unique and of high quality because of the relationship to the place in which they were produced, right? We think of Champagne or Bordeaux, right? These are from regions. Only Champagne from Champagne region, right? Champagne being the three varietals called out in that appellation of origin control program qualify for that label anywhere in the world. These are internationally protected branding opportunities when done right, the right way. So the state folded this into the cultivation statute, and no later than January of 2021, the Department of Food and Agriculture is supposed to establish a process by which licensed cultivators may establish appellations of origin. And we have struggled with this language, to be honest with you. In 2017, we saw some changes to this language, and what originally read that cultivators may establish appellations of origin standards, practices, and varietals applicable to cannabis grown in certain geographical areas in California. Someone talked the governor into removing origin from this language. So the language currently reads that CDFA may develop appellation of standards, practices, and varietals, which essentially creates a statutory pathway to remove the cannabis and that connection to place for this program. So under this statute, theoretically, we could have appellations of standards being, my standard is to cultivate my cannabis indoors, and my practice is to use Fox Farm potting soil. And so this could potentially remove the appellation component that ties this opportunity to place, to the native environment, to the natural soil, and the unique qualities of, yes, the surroundings.
What are the conversations that you've been having with growers in Humboldt? Because I know a lot of folks out there growing mixed media, in bags and big smart pots. So.
I think the conversation is tricky because appellation of origin is not developed because we want everybody to have it. Appellation of origin is a specialty program of very high standards. And what it does is it holds up usually the value of everyone in that region, right? The conversations are mixed. Farmers are afraid. Everybody wants appellation of origin. They recognize it as like the premium branding opportunity. It's the name of place, right? And so this is political. And right now, California Department of Food and Agriculture has hired a number of scientists to actually work on this. And I think it's going to be a political outcome, right? The AVA does not have, California does not have appellation of origin for wine. Largely, the United States does not have appellation of origin for any products. They have geographical indicators. So we're hoping to change that with cannabis, but it is going to be a political battle. And farmers, I think, need a lot of education to understand how a handful of very high quality farms that meet appellation of origin standards, right, actually hold up the value of that entire bioregion. And so it's going to take some time, and luckily we have until 2021. It's right around the corner. But it's one of our primary focuses of work as ICFA, to be honest with you. The other thing that California did in this regulatory process, which was super unique to all of the other states that have brought cannabis on, was they conducted a program environmental impact report. None of the other programs for commercial cannabis anywhere in the United States have done any environmental studies on their program, especially not up front, right? There's been data collection and some information that has been garnered from that. But California actually conducted a PEIR up front, and in doing so, they compared the program that was passed or developed based on statute to a multitude of programs. One of them was, what if we have no program? What are the environmental impacts of that, right? That was one of the programs they compared the current program to. They also compared it to, what if we eliminate all outdoor cultivation and we just force all of this into high-intensity discharge light usage? That was the other program that they compared to. And then they compared, the other alternative was the no high-intensity lighting program. And what they determined was that from among the alternatives that they looked at, the no high-intensity grow light alternative was considered environmentally superior. This alternative would focus cultivation activities on outdoor and mixed light techniques using natural lighting, primarily, which is what we looked at in the ML1 picture. And so, therefore, it would vastly reduce the energy use associated with cannabis cultivation, the related air quality issues that energy use participates in or drives, and it would also vastly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, not to mention fire hazards and other health risks from working in an indoor setting. However, the state said, well, let's figure out how much cannabis is cultivated and how it's cultivated in California, and based on Drug Enforcement Administration and eradication numbers, the state determined that 80% of California's cannabis is cultivated outdoors. Well, okay, so they thought this was pretty much a moot point. Well, if 80% of the cannabis is cultivated outdoors, we don't really have to worry about this alternative of the high-intensity light usage because, 80% of it's going to be from outdoors anyway, so it will just offset itself naturally. Well, let's see how that worked. So, a recent report that came out from New Frontier, which I think John sent to folks, says that outdoor cannabis cultivation actually accounts for in excess of about 50% of the total cannabis produced and supplied in the United States, okay? So the state said, okay, 80% of California's cannabis comes from outdoor cultivation. About 50% of what we consume as a nation comes from outdoor. However, indoor and greenhouse production is by far more prevalent in the legal marketplace. This is kind of a prohibitionary model. I can take the cannabis, I can put it in a box, and constituents, voters, don't see it, they don't smell it, they don't have to deal with it, and theoretically it might be easier to secure. This is the thought. So when we were looking at, what was probably going to unfold in California, my colleagues and I were very suspicious that we were going to see a very industrial model come forward. We were going to see a lot of indoor development, new cultivation, build-outs, and less ability for the traditional outdoor farmers to actually participate in the regulated market, even though they've been kind of the backbone of the regulated market and the non-regulated market for decades. So we looked at energy consumption based on, and this is just lights for flowering, based on what the first draft of emergency regs had proposed. And the first draft of emergency regs, we're going back a whole year now, they only had one mixed light tier. It was basically you were outdoor, open air cropping, you pull no light up tarps, right? And you can be outdoor. Anytime you pull a light up tarp or you put a light bulb in a canopy area, you get put into this mixed light. So what we did is we took the lighting that California was talking about, and we kind of split the mixed light tier into what we're seeing up north, which is zero lighting in those hoops for light deprivation, or just enough lighting used for 2 weeks in May so that when I plant my well-rooted clones or seedlings into the May wet, foggy soil, I have short days, I can turn like a light bulb on, literally 7 watts per, every 10 feet maybe at the most, right? I can turn those lights on just to trick the plants into thinking that they have another 2 or 3 hours of daylight, because cannabis wants to naturally start flowering once it starts getting down to about 13 hours of daylight. We get down to 12 and it's game on, right? There it's like, 10 is even better. But so in doing this, we said, okay, let's compare these lighting numbers to how much electricity an average household uses. That's right around 11,800 kilowatts a year. So kilowatt hours per year. So we just went with 12,000. I like round numbers, right? So I just bumped it up. And what we found out was that a 22,000 square foot indoor operation achieving 6 harvests, 5 harvests or 6 harvests, it's a year-round cycle. We counted an 8-week flower period, getting 6 harvests here. And it's the same sort of energy consumption as putting an additional 298 homes on the grid. Just one 22,000 square foot indoor operation, and that's just in lighting. Just in lighting. We are using high intensity discharge lighting because in California, indoor cultivation uses lighting in excess of 25 watts per square foot.
So you weren't using LEDs?
It's
That's pretty game-changing.
It's pretty game-changing in some ways. It reduces the energy consumption, but it also reduces the mass of the flowers. It reduces your productivity, and there are health risks associated with working under LEDs daily at that intensity, and a lot of reports are just coming out. We're just starting to learn about how LEDs mess with our bodies. Russ?
Also, from a pharmacology standpoint, where I come from, it changes the entire profiling or structure of the plant.
That's great. That to me sounds like a research project,
Yeah.
not something not to be looked at. I mean, the problem with that sort of analysis is it's really wide open for criticism because you've done half of an LCA, half of an ISO.
It's not meant to be anything more than to look at what the state regulated. So if you had LEDs in your facility and you come in at less than 25 watts a square foot, you are not an indoor operation in California. You are a mixed light operation. So the state mandates indoor is more than 25 watts a square foot. So it's really was, how do we look at what the state is putting forth and kind of show some consequences to how they're regulating, right? They would be better off, I think, and more successful in managing environmental issues if they weren't dictating how we cultivate, right? They let some evolution take place naturally because they were going to base the tiers of cultivation on production amounts. Then this would be completely 100% irrelevant, but this was to kind of show the state what their consequences are.
Is that not a model, and I'm getting a little dark here, a great model for lobbyists for PG&E in Southern California Edison?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're lining up to provide incentives, right? Edison does not sell enough electricity to keep their plants running at capacity. Cannabis is a boon for them, right? They're very excited about cannabis. So But when we look at how energy is used in cultivation, this is an old slide from the Evan Mills study in 2011, somewhat outdated, but I think the percentages of how we utilize energy in the cultivation setting are very, very similar to this, right? So when we move cannabis off the farm and we push it indoors into the traditional high-intensity discharge light usage model, around 32% of the energy consumed producing that cannabis goes directly into just the lighting alone. And then we have heating, cooling, ventilation, dehumidifiers. Vehicles, we aren't going to get around, right? Whether you're outdoor or you're indoor, you're still using vehicles to transport, right? So I think it is worth kind of understanding how we get into these larger energy usage pieces. This information here is out of the New Frontier report that was conducted with the Resource Innovation Institute. And the Resource Innovation Institute created a power score. And the idea of that power score is to assess the energy utilized over the course of the production of the cannabis crop. So they're looking at from seed or propagation all the way through processing and into the package. So it's your drying, curing, electrical usage as well. And this really focuses on how many megawatt hours are used. And so what we've seen is that there has been 162% change from 2017. Well, we've had a lot of facilities come online with additional legalization and new programs coming online. So we're seeing energy use increase significantly. And the projections going forward, it doesn't show signs of slowing potentially. When we compare that to CO2 emissions in the tons, right? Cannabis can be a very needy and pollution-oriented crop, the way that we've been looking at it from a very prohibition stance. And so it's disappointing. The pink column here has a typo. It's actually supposed to say 2022. And if we were to look at some benchmarks here, how that kind of boils down, those numbers boil down into the difference between indoor greenhouse and, say, outdoor, electricity productivity. So how many grams are produced of cannabis per kilowatt hour? Well, outdoors, you can produce 14.4 grams per kilowatt hour versus 0.8 grams, right, indoor. So efficiencies, right? We go back to farming, we get more efficient. And then again, these numbers I find they're fascinating to me. I'm not going to read through them, but in my books, they're fascinating and slightly horrifying because, we're in the Sunshine State. We have all of this capacity for agriculture, and yet the most rapidly developing sector of cannabis cultivation is all-season production. That's what we're going to see here. So I cannot see my screen because I'm fairly blind. So consumption per gram, right? So per gram, indoors using around 1.27 kilowatt hours versus outdoor at 0.07 kilowatt hours. That's a big difference, right? And in a state that has very rigorous carbon goals, I'm not really sure what we're doing here, right? So, correspondingly, in 2017, the U.S. combined, right, used an estimated total of 4.2 million megawatt hours of electricity to produce 16.4 million pounds of cannabis for consumption. That's a lot of electricity. And not all of that electricity is from renewable resources. The vast majority of it is from fossil fuels and from non-renewables. Probably upwards of 80%. Legal cannabis cultivation in the U.S. consumes an estimated 1.1 million megawatt hours of electricity-based energy. It's enough to power about 93,000 homes, right? Or a community the size of Anaheim. So in California, right, the Sunshine State, let's look at some licensing stats. So I went through and I downloaded all of the licenses from Cal Cannabis yesterday. So this is current. This is what we have issued in the state. I threw out all of the inactive licenses, which is about 50% for each category. And what we found was if you just look at the number of licenses issued, right, in each of these categories, outdoor versus ML1 versus ML2 or indoor, outdoor definitely has taken 41% of the licenses issued in the state. But when we look at the square footage issued, not cumulative square footage, but just square footage that represents, outdoor is only 21% of the square footage planted in California, and the ML1 category is a whopping 50%. But when we look at production, because we look at the difference between outdoor having one harvest versus ML2 or ML1 is ranked in here as having 3 harvests, which is likely in most parts of the state. The north might only get 2, and really far south where we have better light and sunnier days and a longer season, we might get as many as 4. We went with 3 for this comparison. ML2 and indoor are both at 5 harvests. And so the production, the cannabis that's produced in California that will be consumed, about 5% of that will come from outdoor farms, 5% of it in the Sunshine State. And upwards of 57% of it will come from cannabis that's cultivated in a high intensity discharge light setting. So, we're kind of missing the mark, right? California, again, said that the best program for the environment that they could put into place would be one that does not allow for high intensity discharge light usage. This was the most environmentally superior option California had based on the research conducted during the PEIR. But remember, they blew that off. They said, well, that doesn't really matter because 80% of the cannabis cultivated in the state comes from outdoor farms. But this is what's licensed. So why is that, right? Why is that? This is today. These are numbers that I downloaded last night. So why is that? Well, first of all, I mentioned California Department of Food and Agriculture is the lead agency for cannabis cultivation, but we have other agencies involved. We have the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, right? So if you are collecting water from a surface water source, a stream, a pond, a creek, a spring, you are required to get a lake and streambed alteration agreement from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And that agreement is not just specific to the area where you're cultivating cannabis or the water source associated with that cannabis cultivation. It's specific to the entire property on which your cannabis is being cultivated. So that can be incredibly expensive. You take farmers that are on 40 acres of mountain land that has legacy logging issues and culverts all over the place and back-cut logging flats. And these LSAAs want those culverts replaced, removed, streams fixed, right? And so these are very expensive programs. Once you move cannabis off of that sort of kind of traditional location, we've seen a lot of cannabis cultivation in the mountains in less than appropriate agricultural areas, right? But we have small farms, small homestead farms, cultivating small amounts of cannabis, and it works on that small scale. But they're subject to very expensive lake and stream bed alteration agreements. And the prices for these lake and stream bed alteration agreements are not standard agricultural or landowner prices. They are 8 to 10 times more expensive because California Department of Fish and Wildlife has what's called cannabis rates. So you pay $3,000 for a mitigation fee with your LSAA, and if there's nothing for you to mitigate, they're going to give it back to you, but I don't know anyone who gets their $3,000 back in cannabis. Even us, we applied for our California Department of Fish and Wildlife LSAA. We have to replace one culvert that was about 6 inches undersized for a 100-year flood event. It's been on the property. It's never ran over, but it's been there for 40 years. So We had to replace the one culvert, and then they want us to rip wrap an outlet to another culvert, just so that there couldn't be any erosion or sediment coming off of that culvert. So we did that work. The combination of just getting the LSAA approved by Fish and Wildlife, not writing the LSAA or doing any of the consulting work, but just the fees to Fish and Wildlife alone were $11,000. That doesn't cover the work. It was just the fees. So why is outdoor cannabis cultivation not being permitted? It is one of the most expensive ways to cultivate cannabis in California, even though when done properly, it is the most environmentally friendly way to cultivate cannabis of anywhere in the world, not just in California. So if I was in a urban setting in a warehouse, I would get an LSAA exemption because I would be on municipal water. I would be putting my nutrients into a septic system or a sewer treatment system. And I probably don't have any old logging issues or culverts on my road, right? So these other forms of cultivation, the more industrial methods of cultivation, generally just get an exemption letter from that. And they also, once you enclose your cultivation so that the rain does not hit the ground or the medium where you cultivate, you do not have to be part of the Water Board's agricultural discharge program. So you get to skip that entire regulatory piece too. Who knew? So I think this is largely why we see, and regulators are nervous about outdoor.
I'm curious, we've had a number of folks come from the water boards up in the North Coast area to talk about some of the efforts of the watershed enforcement teams that are going around and looking at some of these violations of in-stream flow operations. I'm curious, sort of, as you guys look up in the North Coast at sustainability issues, are you concerned about summer in-stream flows? Because I know there's some talks about in the wintertime you can store in tanks and then
We've been storing our water on our farm for 10 years, so we haven't been on surface water for a number of years. I mean, I've lived in Humboldt County for 25 years, and as a homesteader and a gardener, it doesn't rain in the summer. So the key it has always been for a lot of folks to figure out how to store, right? Because that water is precious for drinking, right? We want to drink our spring water. A lot of folks have ponds, but there are significant issues with sedimentation and stream flows. And cannabis is one of the straws, right, that pulls water out. But so do humans with their daily life. And what we've seen is Department of Fish and Wildlife and other groups have really gotten rid of grant programs that help landowners manage legacy issues, tree thinning, right? So we have no forest management happening largely on any of the private lands up there unless you have like a really gun-ho landowner. So as the fir saplings have thickened, right, we've gotten more and more of them. They're so tightly spaced together. The amount of water they draw to the table is exponentially more than what cannabis is going to draw or a human interaction is going to draw. And then we have steep and rugged terrain. And one of the biggest issues with sedimentation right now is not cannabis production, it's the road systems that are unmaintained over the winter. So when you live in that kind of environment and folks are absentee over the winter, they're there in the summer when it's really nice, but in the winter we'll get 100 inches of rain, right? Everything washes away in 100 inches of rain over the course of a few months. So those unmaintained roads are massive sedimentation for the stream. So unless we are going to get all of those pieces together, the environmental components that they put onto cannabis are not going to fix these watersheds. So it's a little bit of a bummer. And that's one of the things that would be really great as a university, if you want to do research, do these regulations actually help the environment? That is a big question I have. So one of the things that we did last year when working with regulators to try to better help them understand the impacts of their expensive regulatory system, right? Everything from the cost of cannabis on the marketplace to what the state licensing costs are. We created a 1 acre analysis. And so this is some of the licensing costs. And so We have medium and small type 3s on here are medium size licenses. So in the outdoor, they allow an acre, which is why in the outdoor tier, you only have a type 3 listed, because this is acre to acre, right? 1 acre of outdoor compared to 1 acre of mixed light, 1 compared to 1 acre of ML2 compared to 1 acre of indoor, right? So that's how these are set up. And this is the cost of licensing for an acre in each of those categories, including your state application fees. This does not include any of the Fish and Wildlife or the Water Board licensing programs or local permitting. Question?
Not to, kind of upset anyone, but has California thought long-term about what all of this licensing will cause? Because if cannabis becomes nationally legal, it seems like it's highly incentivized to grow anywhere but California.
I don't know that I understand why that would be.
The licensing in other states is not nearly as expensive.
Oh, well,
Nearly as involved.
this is true. California does have, to that point, California has the most onerous regulatory program out of any cannabis program I am aware of anywhere in the US or the world, frankly. So this is a brand new model. We inserted the distributor, the alcohol distributor model into it, and we removed the ability for farmers to actually conduct sales to the consumer. The farmer is just like, awesome, I can grow this crop and I can't talk to the consumer. I can't sell them any of my flower. I don't really get an opportunity to interact. I have to hopefully, everyone represents me well up the supply chain. Right? This is not typical, but it is what we put into place. And I think California has thought about that somewhat, but I think that there's still a lot of political sentiment that timing is still pretty far out. I'm not sure I agree with that, but in addition, when we looked at this, we looked at multiple market prices, right? In California, we have a flat tax, a flat cultivation tax. It is $44 per pound of leaf material and $148 per pound of finished flower material. It doesn't matter how much you sell your cannabis for, what quality the cannabis is, you pay what you pay per weight, no matter what, right? So what we did here is this color coding section, right, where we have outdoor flower, and then it says, I think it says $1,000 under it twice, and then 800 and then 500. We wanted to compare, right, what the pricing was, what the taxation levels are as we look at different wholesale prices in the marketplace. And then when we were looking at yields, these are the numbers we used for yield. We used 27 grams per square foot of finished flower, and we gave everybody the same amount of finished flower, just to have an across the board, no arguments, everyone gets the same data plugged in. And we gave everybody 15 grams of trim off of the flower that they clipped. And we gave everybody $125 per pound production cost and $175 per pound expense for processing. We gave 20% to our distributor, because distributors take a percentage of your gross receipts. It ranges in California from 10% to about 40%, depending on how much service your distributor provides for you. So we just went with 20. And then we plugged in leaf tax at $2.75 an ounce and state flower tax at $9.25 an ounce. And I hope you can all see this, because I think this is pretty amazing that an acre of outdoor, before you pay for your your local permitting, your water board, right, your Fish and Wildlife, your mortgage, your work person's comp, your insurance, payroll, all of these, any of these other expenses, you are about $133,000 in the hole, okay? And these tax numbers I find pretty horrifying. If everybody is at $1,000 a pound in wholesale, that's a 17% tax just on the cultivation tax alone. But when we get down to $800 or $500 a pound, which is what this is here, it's a whopping 32% cultivation tax. I'm going to tell you, cannabis, bulk cannabis on the marketplace today in the legal market is selling for between $500 and $900 a pound in most cases. So the outdoor farmer usually takes the brunt of that low end of pricing in the marketplace. So many of our outdoor cultivators are somewhere in the 30% cultivation tax range today.
Is there still indoor price premium on the wholesale?
There is. It's lack of education, I think, and I think the consumer. We have not had a consumer movement yet in cannabis, right? We have cannabis is still manna from heaven. It's this amazing product that has been forbidden forever. And yet cannabis consumers largely across the board choose botanical medicine, alternative wellness opportunities. They tend to eat organically, right? They are kind of more concerned about taking care of their own health and well-being. Yet they haven't really thought to ask how their cannabis is produced, what the impacts are of the cannabis that they're consuming, right, to the environment, and whether or not it's a pure product, right? They're like, oh my God, I'll take my echinacea and my vitamins and all of my supplements and I'll go eat organic food and I would only drink biodynamic wine, but I will smoke any cannabis on the planet because it is just awesome across the board, right? So I think lacking a massive education and consumer movement, we're kind of stuck here for now. And the bud tenders in general, and I'll answer your question in just a minute, so I see your hand in the back. The dispensaries and the retailers and the bud tenders, like, what is their incentive to educate about this, right? They can sell, eye candy indoor all day long, right? It sits on their top shelf. It's what they think the consumer wants, and maybe it is what some consumers think they want, but trying to have a conversation about the quality of outdoor cannabis that might not be necessarily as dense as this golf ball of indoor cannabis that you can bounce off your desktop, they aren't ready to do that, and they don't have the incentive or the motivation to do that. So, question?
We are in sort of the advent of clean energy. So wouldn't that sort of throw all this into a question? And then
Well, I love that question. So, clean energy, like dams. So, I like salmon and I like orcas, and so dams aren't really great for salmon, so clean energy, yay!
I'm thinking more like desert hot springs is desert, and you can cover it with solar panels and run your greenhouse houses off that.
Well, think about the energy consumption in desert hot springs. You have to mitigate that massive heat trap you've created. And most municipalities will not let the odor escape from those greenhouses. So now you have a fully enclosed greenhouse heat trap structure where you suck the hot air into a head house that is cement floor with steel building on the north side, and you air condition it. And then you pump it back into your greenhouse. So now, yeah, you might have solar panels that can mitigate some of that, but trying to mitigate, greenhouses in a lot of settings, once a municipality is like, okay, I want no odor coming from the greenhouse, the energy consumption in that greenhouse is more consumptive and at higher rates than an indoor operation, because in the indoor operation, you don't have the heat trap, right? You have some heat coming off those lights, but you aren't accumulating daytime heat. So, do you have a second part to that? I know I interrupted you. My apologies.
I was going to say, if you were going to open a 1,000-acre farm in a federally legal situation, would you do it in California, and why?
I don't know if I would do it in California, and the reason why is because in order to have that much space, I'd probably end up in the San Joaquin or the Salinas Valley or one of the other heavily agricultural valleys, and cannabis wicks toxins out of the environment and stores it in the tissues of the plant, which is then transferred into the product at the end, potentially. And so you would have to really have a pristine environment in California to do that, unless you were utilizing that crop, say, for fiber, and then you could use it as a mitigation for the soil as well. So there are other good growing regions. Arizona has some really lovely growing regions. So I think under federal legalization, right, we would see diversity happen where other agricultural regions would try to experiment with this crop. I do expect hemp to really come online in California over the next year and a half. And I'm hoping that that actually helps to kind of normalize cannabis cultivation on an outdoor level. And then I think I had another question. No?
Just
Yes?
thinking cost per acre. I mean, when I grew up in Hillsborough, California, floodplain in Dry Creek Valley before Warm Springs Dam, 1932 was about $30 an acre. Today, the average is about $125,000 an acre for grapes, from when I grew up. So that's a little chilly now. So your cost of capitalization to get there for what you're talking about, yeah, they're going to go to high desert in Arizona or some other place.
And I think the market is diversifying, right? When originally, I'm in my 40s, when I originally kind of started working in cannabis, it was all about the flower, right? It was, you were going to have whole flower products were primarily what you were going to purchase at the dispensary or what you were seeking. We've now diversified that market into edibles that were largely originally made with whole cannabis plant material in butters or oils. And now we've really moved into supercritical extraction processes. And the amount of cannabis being used in these supercritical extraction processes is copious, right? It's a vast quantity of cannabis. So if we were going to look at what the largest kind of fastest growing aspects of cannabis consumption is in the oils and the concentrates. We see this in just about every state. Those are generally the fastest growing sectors in the market. I do not believe that we have the ability to cultivate that much cannabis in high-intensity discharge light settings to actually meet the demand that we're coming online with. And if we saw federal legalization and these products be available to the United States and to cross state lines, that demand would skyrocket. So we are going to have to get back into farming. Now, will there still be premium products cultivated indoors or in all-season greenhouse settings or even in seasonal greenhouse settings? Absolutely, right? Especially if we're looking at a premium product that's from Michigan that's going to be offered year-round, right? We're gonna see some creative opportunities, but those should be the smaller scale, frankly, if we're going to address environmental issues. And then the larger scale, or the vast majority of the cannabis that we produce, really should go back to the farm.
So what's the future here? I'm wondering, like, what's going on in the market?
There's a lot of pain, a lot of stress. I do licensing consulting, and I kind of, my joke is that I consult about 20% of the time, and I counsel about 80% of the time. Okay, so let's finish this up really quick. So solutions, I have 2 more slides for you, solutions. Appellation of origin could be a major solution, right? Appellation of origin actually, when it's research-based, helps to preserve the traditions and the cultural components of cannabis. And we have traditional and cultural components to cannabis throughout California, the US, and the world. It establishes regional standards. So a scale that's appropriate in Humboldt County, right, in a mountainous terrain is not the same scale that's appropriate in the San Joaquin Valley, right? So you put these standards that are specific to the region to help protect the longevity of that region and hold that crop's quality up, right? And then it incentivizes those agricultural standards by creating a premium product that's branded, recognized, and protected. And then it strengthens regional marketing and branding. It develops agritourism for these areas. And it drives the development of the craft cannabis market. Right now, we have craft cannabis on everybody's labels. I can put it on my 22,000 square foot indoor if I want to, or I can put it on my 25 plant outdoor. No one cares, it's all the same. There's no protections. So, okay. So we also need to reduce barriers, lots of regulatory components, and tax incentives. So I will leave it there, and we'll go to the next room.
That's great. Thanks, Charlie.
That's okay. Okay, sorry about that.
No, it's not a problem. We have more questions than that.
So we're going to meet downstairs, folks, in 5 minutes.